Don't take me home. George Whitaker's hand clamped around my forearm so hard I nearly hit the brakes. He had been out of the hospital less than 60 seconds. 12 days after a stroke, the 82-year-old should have wanted home. Instead, he stared at the hospital entrance like someone was coming after him. Thomas, drive to Rebecca Collins's office. Now, before my children realize I'm gone. I looked at him. George, Karen thinks I'm taking you straight home. Then don't call Karen. His voice dropped to a whisper. And whatever happens next, don't trust Stephen. I shifted my truck into drive. If you think family loyalty has limits, stay with me. I was about to discover mine. My name is Thomas Reed. I was 58 and had spent 30 years repairing heating and air conditioning systems around central Ohio. Karen and I had been married for 30 years, and her brothers had never been impressed by my modest HVAC business. Stephen owned a commercial landscaping company. Brian sold commercial real estate. George was different. He never measured me by money. Whenever I visited his farm outside Lancaster, he'd point toward the porch and say, "Coffee's fresh." That was enough. 12 days earlier, George had suffered a mild stroke while feeding cattle. Dr. Andrew Foster expected a good recovery. On discharge morning, Stephen claimed a business emergency. Brian had golf with clients, and Karen had a church meeting. Stephen texted, "Thomas can get him. He's basically retired anyway. Nobody asked me. I went anyway." Now George sat beside me, terrified of going home. 10 minutes later, George locked the doors. Click. He pulled a small digital recorder from his flannel shirt. "I need you to hear why." He pressed play. Static crackled through the speakers. Then Stephen's voice filled my truck. "If we split the south field into residential lots, we'll make twice as much." Brian laughed. "No point waiting forever. Dad probably won't make another Christmas anyway." A hospital monitor beeped faintly behind them. Stephen spoke again. "Start talking to developers. Once probate clears, we move fast." George stopped the recording. I stared through the windshield. "They said that in your hospital room?" They thought I was asleep. "George," I heard every word. His fingers trembled around the recorder. "My sons were planning what to do with my land while I was lying 10 feet away." George looked away, then added, "The worst part is, this didn't start in that hospital." I glanced at him. "What do you mean?" He slipped the recorder back into his pocket. "I've been waiting 12 years for today." That number hit me. 12 years for what? For the day I'd finally know who I could trust. He gave me an address downtown. I recognized the name when he said it. Attorney Rebecca Collins, an estate and probate lawyer George had used for years. "Does she know we're coming?" I asked. "She's been waiting. Since this morning?" George slowly shook his head. "No, Thomas. For 7 years." My phone began vibrating in the cup holder. Karen, then Stephen, then Brian. George watched their names flash across the screen. "Don't answer. Karen is my wife." "I know." "Then tell me what I'm walking into." His eyes met mine. "I will. But first you need to see what I've been protecting." The phone rang again. I let it ring. George leaned back, exhausted, and closed his eyes. "By tonight," he whispered, "everyone in my family may hate you." I turned toward downtown Columbus, unaware that the next hour would put my marriage, my reputation, and 30 years of work directly in the path of a family war. By the time we reached Rebecca Collins's office, my phone showed 11 missed calls. Karen, Stephen, Brian. George looked at the screen. "Turn it off." I did. Rebecca Collins was waiting when we reached her office near the courthouse. "George, Thomas, come in." No surprise in her voice. In the conference room, George handed her a brass key. Rebecca unlocked a fireproof cabinet and removed a thick sealed envelope covered with dust. "This has been here 7 years," she said. I stared at George. 7 years? He lowered himself into a chair. I prayed I'd never need it. Inside were handwritten notes, property records, dated letters, emails, and maps of the Whitaker farm, organized by year. This wasn't panic after a stroke. It was preparation. "I started after my wife died," George said. Stephen and Brian changed slowly. That's how greed works. First it sounds like concern, then advice. Eventually people discuss what belongs to you as if you're already dead. "Do they know this exists?" "No." "Karen?" His expression changed. There are things my daughter doesn't know, Thomas, and things she chose not to know. I wanted to defend my wife, but he continued. Remember those fishing trips we never managed to take? Our schedules never matched. That's not what happened. I called your house, left messages, gave Karen dates. My stomach tightened. She never told me. I know. Why? Stephen never liked how close we'd become. He thought I trusted you too much. George said, my sons see this farm as an inheritance waiting for a funeral. What are you changing? I'm not telling you yet. Then why bring me? Because I need someone who will follow instructions even when it costs him something, Rebecca spoke. George has met with me privately several times. His decisions were made without family involvement. His mental capacity is documented, and independent witnesses are in place. I looked at George. You expected a fight. I know my children. Rebecca asked me to wait outside. George met with her alone. I witnessed no signature and knew nothing about who would receive the farm or money. When the door opened, George looked exhausted but calm. Rebecca said, everything is complete. Outside, I switched my phone on. Messages flooded the screen. Stephen, what did you do? Brian, call me now. Karen, Thomas, please tell me where Dad is. I showed George. Take me home. What do I tell them? That I asked you to drive and you kept your word. They're going to think I influenced you. They may accuse you of worse. He placed a hand on my shoulder. Do not defend yourself by revealing what happened here. Even to Karen? He hesitated. Even to Karen. I stared at him. You're asking me to keep a secret from my wife. I'm asking you to keep a promise until the truth can protect itself. And if it damages my marriage, pain crossed his face, then I'll regret that. But if Stephen learns what I did today before Rebecca is ready, he'll attack you, her, and every decision I made. On the drive toward Lancaster, George finally said, do you know why I chose you? No. Because everyone else wants to know what they'll get. You haven't asked once. I don't want your property. I know. That's why I trust you. When the farm appeared ahead, 3 vehicles were already outside. Stephen's SUV, Brian's car, and Karen's Subaru. George exhaled. They're waiting. I turned onto the gravel. Before my truck stopped, Stephen stormed off the porch. He didn't ask whether his father was all right. He looked straight at me. Where the hell have you been? George quietly reached for the door. Remember your promise. Then he stepped out, leaving me to face a family that already believed I had something to hide. Stephen reached my truck before I could unbuckle. Where the hell did you take him? I stepped out. Where he asked me to go. Brian followed him off the porch. We've been calling for hours, Thomas. Neither man looked toward George until his cane struck the gravel. If either of you had been available this morning, George said, you wouldn't need to ask Thomas anything. Stephen's expression softened. Dad, we were worried. No, you were curious. He walked toward the house. Karen met us in the kitchen and hugged her father. Then she looked at me. Can we talk later? After 30 years, I knew that tone. Dinner was almost silent until Stephen asked, Dad, where did Thomas take you? George answered, I asked him to drive. He drove. To Rebecca Collins? Brian asked. George stared at him. Why would that concern you? Brian glanced at Stephen. We just want to make sure nobody pressured you after a stroke. George's eyes hardened. Doctor. Andrew Foster examined my mind. Did you? Stephen said. We're your sons. Then perhaps one of you should have picked me up. Nobody answered. Around 11:30 that night, I saw light inside the garage. My truck door was open. Karen stood beside the driver's seat with a flashlight, searching the center console. The glove compartment hung open and papers covered the seat. Karen, what are you doing? She jumped, looking for a receipt. From Rebecca Collins's office? Her face answered first. Stephen thinks Dad changed his estate documents. So you searched my truck? I needed to know. What did Dad sign? I can't tell you. Can't or won't? I gave George my word. I'm your wife, Thomas. I know. 30 years and you're keeping my father's decisions from me? They're his decisions to explain. She stepped closer. Did he change the farm? Did he cut Stephen and Brian out? Did he put you in the will? I don't know what he signed. Rebecca met with him alone. But you know why he went there. I thought of Stephen's recorded voice. Dad probably won't make another Christmas anyway. I know what George told me, and I promise not to repeat it. Her voice cracked. So his secret matters more than your marriage? Don't make me choose between keeping my word and proving I love you. You already chose. She walked past me and shut the bedroom door upstairs. The next morning, Rebecca called. Thomas, George completed everything. The trust is effective. What does that mean for me? For now, say nothing. Karen searched my truck last night. Rebecca went quiet. Then Stephen is already looking for information. I only drove George. I know. That's why he trusts you. For what? She paused. I can't answer that yet. Prepare yourself. Things may become uncomfortable. By Thursday, I understood how badly she had understated it. At Miller's Hardware, conversation stopped when I entered. At the diner, two men lowered their voices as I passed. Sunday at church, an old friend pulled me aside. Thomas, I hope what people are saying isn't true. What are they saying? He hesitated. That you isolated George after his stroke and convinced him to cut his children out. I drove him where he asked me to drive. I believe you, but Stephen's telling a different story. Walking back to my truck, I realized the secret had escaped the family. Less than a week earlier, I had simply shown up when everyone else was too busy. Now Stephen was turning that act into evidence that I was a thief. And the worst part wasn't that strangers might believe him. It was that Karen, the woman who had known me for 30 years, had already started wondering whether he was right. 3 days later, I noticed a gray SUV across the street from our house. I saw it again outside a service call that afternoon, then beside the grocery store the next morning. The third time, I watched the driver lift a camera toward me. I crossed the parking lot. He started the engine and pulled away before I reached him. That evening, I called Rebecca Collins. Someone's following me. She was silent for a moment. Stephen hired a private investigator. I gripped the phone. For what? He's trying to build an undue influence case. He wants evidence that you isolated George, pressured him, or expected to benefit from the trust. I repair furnaces, Rebecca. I didn't manipulate anybody. I know. But Stephen doesn't need the truth yet. He needs enough suspicion to make people repeat his version. That was exactly what happened. Within days, the rumors began costing me more than uncomfortable looks. A longtime commercial customer called while I was replacing a rooftop unit. Thomas, we're moving our maintenance contract. Did we do something wrong? No, your work's always been solid. He paused. I've heard there's going to be litigation over your father-in-law's estate. Corporate doesn't want trouble. I sat in my truck after the call, staring at the steering wheel. 2 days later, another customer canceled. Then a third. Sunday at church, conversation slowed when I entered. After the service, my old friend Carl pulled me aside. Stephen says you kept George away from his children after the stroke. I picked him up once. I know. Then why is anyone believing this? Carl looked uncomfortable. Because Stephen keeps saying you were the last person alone with George before the trust changed. Rebecca was alone with him. I waited outside. Carl sighed. Silence leaves room for somebody else to tell the story. On Tuesday, the damage reached my bank. The manager invited me into his office. Thomas, underwriting needs additional documentation before renewing your credit line. Why? Potential litigation connected to an inheritance dispute. I haven't inherited anything. I understand. But your name appears in the complaint they're preparing. Walking back to my truck, I finally understood Stephen's strategy. He wasn't trying to prove I had done something wrong. He was trying to make defending myself so expensive, lonely, and exhausting that I would eventually step aside. That night, Karen found me packing a small bag. Where are you going? A motel for a few days. You don't have to leave. Every conversation we have turns into an interrogation. Her eyes filled. Because you won't tell me anything. Because your father asked me not to. Stephen says you're protecting yourself. I stopped packing. And what do you say? She couldn't answer. That silence made the decision for me. 30 years, Karen. If Stephen can erase that with a rumor, we have a bigger problem than George's trust. She whispered. I don't know what to believe. That's exactly what Stephen wanted. I drove to a roadside motel outside Lancaster. The air conditioner rattled, so out of habit I tightened 2 screws before sitting alone on the bed. For the first time since George climbed into my truck, I wondered whether keeping my promise was worth losing my wife, my customers, and the reputation I'd spent my life earning. My phone lit up. Rebecca. Thomas. Come to my office tomorrow night. I found something Stephen doesn't know we have. What? Ass. Proof this didn't begin after George's stroke. I looked at the motel door, suddenly wide awake. How far back? Rebecca's answer changed everything. Months before the hospital, Thomas. Maybe longer. Rebecca Collins locked the office door behind me and placed a thick folder on the conference table. Before you open this, understand something. George didn't create the trust because of what happened in the hospital. The recording only confirmed what he already feared. I sat down. Then what started it? Rebecca opened the folder. The first document was an email dated 5 months before George's stroke. Stephen had written to a regional developer about the Whitaker farm. The subject line read, "Preliminary development opportunity." I read it twice. George knew about this? Not then. Beneath it were maps dividing the South Field into residential lots, estimates for roads and utilities, projected sale prices, and tax calculations. Brian's name appeared on several pages. He's a real estate broker, I said. He prepared the market analysis, Rebecca replied. Keep going. The next document was dated 3 months before George entered the hospital. Letter of intent pending probate. I felt my stomach tighten. Probate? George was alive. Exactly. Stephen had been negotiating with a developer as if control of the land were only a matter of waiting for his father to die. The proposed project included 48 residential lots, road access through the east pasture, and a deposit to be placed in escrow after probate. How did George get these? Someone forwarded one email to him by mistake. After that, he started looking. Rebecca showed me printed messages between Stephen and Brian. One read, "Once Dad is gone, Linda won't fight us if we tell her the farm costs too much to maintain." Another said, "Thomas might complain, but he has no ownership." My name sat there in black ink, months before I'd ever driven George to this office. They were already thinking about me? Because they knew George listened to you. I pushed the papers away. Stephen is telling everyone I manipulated him after the stroke while he was planning this before George ever got sick. That's why these dates matter. Rebecca turned to another section. Bank records showed a payment from Stephen's company into an escrow account connected to the proposed development. He put money down? A preliminary deposit. Not enough to transfer property, but enough to prove this wasn't casual conversation. Does Stephen know you have this? No. Then why haven't we released it? Rebecca folded her hands. Because George told me not to turn this into a public war while he's alive unless Stephen forces us. He wants his children to have one final opportunity to stop. I laughed without humor. Stephen hired someone to follow me. He's costing me customers. I know. Karen barely trusts me. I know that too. And I'm supposed to stay quiet? Rebecca looked directly at me. George believes character is revealed by what people do when they think nobody can stop them. I stood and walked toward the window. That's easy to say when it isn't your marriage falling apart. You're right, her answer stopped me. But there's another reason George chose you. He keeps saying that. Then ask him about 12 years ago. I turned. What happened 12 years ago? That's his story to tell. When I returned to the motel, an envelope had been pushed under my door. Inside was a photograph of me entering Rebecca's office and a typed sentence. Walk away before you lose more than a farm that isn't yours. I called Rebecca immediately. This isn't rumor anymore. Don't touch anything else. Photograph it and put it in a plastic sleeve. You think Stephen sent it? I think we document facts before accusing anyone. I sat on the edge of the bed, holding the photograph by its corners. 10 minutes later, Karen called. I almost ignored it. Thomas, she said when I answered, Stephen says Dad isn't competent anymore. He wants us to support an emergency guardianship petition. My chest tightened. Do you? Silence. Karen? I don't know. Then go talk to your father before you help somebody take away his right to speak for himself. She started crying. Why can't you just tell me what you know? Because George trusted me when everyone else was already calculating what would happen after he died. She hung up. I stared at the photograph on the bed. For the first time, walking away seemed easier than staying. Then, my phone rang again. George. His voice was weak but clear. Thomas, come to the farm tomorrow night. Alone. Why? He paused. Because Rebecca told you to ask about 12 years ago, didn't she? I said nothing. George understood. It's time you knew why I never forgot what you did for this family. George was waiting on the porch when I reached the farm the next evening. A blanket covered his legs, and 2 mugs of coffee sat on the table between us. Sit down, Thomas. I took the chair beside him. Rebecca told me to ask about 12 years ago. George nodded. I told her you'd eventually need to know. Know what? He stared across the dark fields. 12 years ago, Stephen's landscaping company was almost finished. He'd expanded too quickly, bought equipment on credit, lost 2 major contracts, and owed the bank more than he could pay. I remembered that year. Stephen had suddenly stopped showing off new trucks, but nobody told me why. He came to me asking for help, George continued. I had land, but almost no cash without selling something your mother-in-law and I had spent our lives building. Then he looked at me. You remember what you did? I did. I just hadn't known George knew the whole story. Karen had told me her father was struggling to help Stephen. I withdrew $90,000 from the retirement account I'd spent years building and gave it to George as a private loan. I told you never to tell anyone. You said Stephen would never accept it if he knew the money came from you. He hated needing me even then. George shook his head. No, Thomas. He hated the idea of owing you. The money kept Stephen's company alive until new contracts arrived. George repaid every dollar over the next 4 years. Karen never knew where the money had come from. Neither did Stephen or Brian. Why bring this up now? I asked. Because you're sitting in a motel while my children tell this town you're trying to steal from us. His voice hardened. 12 years ago, you risked nearly half your retirement to save a man who barely respected you, then demanded that nobody know. A greedy man doesn't do that. I looked toward the barn. That doesn't mean I want anything now. Exactly. George reached inside his jacket and pulled out a sealed white envelope with my name written across it. Keep this. I didn't take it. What is it? Something Rebecca doesn't have. George, take it. I finally did. When do I open it? Only when there is no other choice. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving you. I slipped the envelope inside my coat. George leaned back, breathing harder than before. I heard about the investigator and your customers. Rebecca told you? Small town told me. Then let me release the documents. Let people see what Stephen was doing. Not yet. Frustration rose in my chest. I'm losing my business. Karen doesn't trust me. Stephen is talking about guardianship. What exactly are we waiting for? George looked directly at me. For him to choose whether he wants to be my son or the man waiting for me to die. I had no answer. After a moment he said, if he files for guardianship, Rebecca has Dr. Andrew Foster's evaluation. My mind is mine, Thomas. Stephen won't take that while I'm breathing. And afterward? George glanced toward the farmhouse. Afterward, the documents speak. Before I left, he caught my wrist. Promise me one more thing. What? Don't let what my children are doing turn you into someone who needs revenge. I'm not looking for revenge. Good. Protect the truth. Let consequences do the rest. 3 nights later, I was still at the motel when Karen called at 5:18 in the morning. She couldn't finish the first sentence. I heard her trying to breathe between sobs. Thomas, Dad. I was already reaching for my keys. What happened? I came downstairs and found him in his chair. The ambulance is here. My stomach dropped. Is he alive? The silence lasted too long. Then Karen whispered, no. I drove toward the Whitaker farm before sunrise with George's sealed envelope in my jacket. By the time I arrived, Stephen and Brian were already there. Stephen stood beside the porch, watching the paramedics leave. His eyes moved from my face to the pocket where the envelope rested. He didn't ask why I had come. He asked the question George had spent years preparing for. What did Dad give you? I looked at Stephen standing beside the porch and kept my hand away from the envelope in my jacket. Your father gave me his trust. Stephen stepped closer. That's not what I asked. What did he give you? Something he told me not to open unless there was no other choice. Brian came down the steps. Convenient. Dad dies, and suddenly Thomas has a secret envelope. Karen appeared in the doorway, her face swollen from crying. Not now, Stephen. This is exactly when we need to know. I looked at him. Your father died less than an hour ago, and you've been meeting privately with his lawyer for weeks. George met with Rebecca privately. I drove him. Stephen gave a cold laugh. We'll see what a judge thinks. The funeral was 4 days later. I stood beside Karen even though we were still living apart. Stephen barely spoke to me. Brian avoided me completely. After the service, Rebecca Collins approached us near the cemetery gate. The trust documents will be reviewed next week. Until then, nobody is authorized to sell, transfer, mortgage, or negotiate George's farm. Stephen's jaw tightened. You don't get to decide that. George already did. 3 weeks later, a process server arrived at my HVAC shop. Stephen had filed a petition in Fairfield County Probate Court challenging the trust. The allegations were worse than the rumors. According to the filing, George lacked sufficient mental capacity after his stroke, and I had exploited his vulnerability, isolated him from his children, transported him secretly to Rebecca's office, and influenced him for personal financial benefit. I read the phrase twice. Undue influence. My technician asked, "Boss, you okay?" "No, but get back to work." I drove straight to Rebecca. She read the petition without changing expression. "We expected this. He says I manipulated George for money. I don't even know what the trust gives me. Nothing personally." I stared at her. "What?" "You are not a beneficiary of the farm." For the first time in weeks, I almost laughed. "Then what exactly am I supposed to have manipulated him into giving me?" "Responsibility." She opened George's trust documents. The Whitaker farm had been transferred into the Bennett family trust structure George had established to preserve the property. Stephen and Brian could receive limited distributions, but neither could force a sale, subdivision, or mortgage of the farmland. "And me?" Rebecca pointed to one paragraph. "George named you successor trustee." I stared at my name. "He made me responsible for protecting the farm." "Yes." "I don't own it?" "No." "I can't sell it to myself?" "No." "I can't take the land?" "No." "Then Stephen is suing because I can stop him from selling it." "Now you understand." The hearing was scheduled before Judge Robert Hayes. Stephen's attorney immediately began telling reporters that an outsider had inserted himself into a grieving family's inheritance. Rebecca warned me not to respond publicly. Then the subpoenas arrived. Dr. Andrew Foster would testify about George's mental capacity. Rebecca would testify about every private meeting. Bank and property records would establish when Stephen began negotiating with developers. And Edward Lawson, Stephen's retired former accountant, had agreed to testify. "Why him?" I asked. Rebecca slid a document across the table. "Because Stephen asked Edward to prepare tax projections for selling the farm months before George's stroke." I looked at the date. It matched the development documents. "Stephen doesn't know he's testifying?" "He does now." My phone buzzed. Karen had sent one sentence. "Stephen says you're trying to take Dad's farm through the trust. Is that true?" I typed back, "No. I'm trying to make sure nobody takes it against George's wishes." Seconds later, she called, "Thomas, tell me everything." I closed my eyes. "I can't." "Not before court. You're still protecting his secrets?" "I'm protecting his evidence." She went quiet. "Is there really evidence against Stephen?" "Come to the hearing." "And then?" I looked at George's unopened envelope on Rebecca's desk. "Then you'll hear your father explain why he did this." The morning of the hearing, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and people I had known most of my life. Stephen walked past me in a dark suit without speaking. Karen stood between her brothers for several seconds, then crossed the steps and came to my side. "I'm not saying I understand," she whispered, "but I'm listening." Inside, Judge Robert Hayes entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. Stephen's attorney stood first. "Your Honor, this case concerns an elderly stroke victim whose vulnerable condition was exploited by a man positioned to control his family's most valuable asset." Rebecca leaned toward me. "Don't react." I looked across the aisle at Stephen. He seemed completely confident. He still believed this case was about what happened after George's stroke. He had no idea Rebecca was about to prove it had started months before. Dr. Andrew Foster was the first witness Rebecca called. Stephen's attorney tried to make George's stroke sound like mental decline. "Doctor, an 82-year-old stroke patient can experience confusion, correct?" "Yes." George Whitaker did not. "Doctor, Foster explained that George had passed repeated cognitive evaluations before discharge. He understood the date, his property, his family, and the consequences of his decisions." Rebecca asked. Was he capable of making independent legal decisions? Absolutely. Any evidence Thomas Reed controlled his thinking? None. Rebecca testified next that George met her privately while I waited outside. Did Thomas tell George how to structure the trust or ask to receive the farm? Never. Stephen's attorney attacked the secret trip to her office. Rebecca didn't blink. George requested the ride. Confidentiality is not manipulation. Judge Robert Hayes reviewed Dr. Foster's records and independent witness statements. Then Rebecca approached the evidence table. The petition claims this dispute began after George's stroke. The dates prove otherwise. The first email appeared on the courtroom monitor. Stephen had contacted a developer 5 months before the stroke. Next came Brian's market analysis. Maps dividing the South Field into 48 residential lots, infrastructure estimates, and the letter of intent marked pending probate. Karen covered her mouth. Rebecca read the date aloud. 3 months before George entered the hospital, she displayed the escrow record. George was alive and competent while his sons were already preparing to profit from his land after probate. Stephen's attorney objected. Judge Hayes overruled him. Then Rebecca played the hospital recording. Stephen's voice filled the courtroom. If we split the South Field into residential lots, we'll make twice as much, Brian answered. No point waiting forever. Dad probably won't make another Christmas anyway. Karen began crying. Brian stared at the floor. Stephen didn't move. Rebecca stopped the recording. George heard that while lying in his hospital bed. Edward Lawson testified next. Stephen asked me to prepare tax projections for a possible sale and subdivision of the Whitaker property. When? Several months before George's stroke. Did George authorize it? No. What did Stephen tell you? Edward hesitated. That the property would become available after his father's death. Stephen's attorney challenged Edward's memory, but Rebecca produced dated emails supporting him. The accusation against me was collapsing beneath evidence created before I knew any plan existed. During recess, Karen found me. I searched your truck. I believed Stephen before I believed you. Tears filled her eyes. We'll deal with us later, Karen. When court resumed, Stephen took the stand. His attorney called the development discussions harmless contingency planning. Rebecca handed Stephen the letter of intent. Harmless planning usually requires an escrow deposit. I was protecting the family's future. By negotiating property you didn't own, Dad wasn't going to farm forever. Rebecca displayed the hospital transcript. When you said your father probably wouldn't make another Christmas, were you protecting him then? Stephen said nothing. Rebecca returned to our table and picked up one final item. Your Honor, George anticipated that his motives might be questioned after his death. He left a sealed statement with specific instructions about when it could be opened. My chest tightened. The envelope George had handed me on the porch remained sealed. Rebecca placed it in front of me. Judge Hayes looked over his glasses. Mr. Reed, have the circumstances George described occurred? I remembered his words. Only when there is no other choice. I looked at Karen, Stephen, and Brian. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Hayes nodded. Then open it. I slid my finger beneath the seal, knowing George was about to speak to his family one final time. The paper inside George's envelope shook slightly in my hands. His handwriting covered 3 pages. Judge Robert Hayes nodded. Read it, Mr. Reed. I swallowed and began. To my children, and to anyone who believes Thomas Reed persuaded me to make decisions I did not understand. These words are mine. Karen lowered her head. Stephen stared straight ahead. I loved all 3 of my children, but love does not require blindness. Stephen began measuring this farm in dollars while I was still measuring my remaining life in seasons. Brian helped him calculate what my fields could become after I was gone. Karen saw enough to know something was wrong, but too often chose peace over questions. Karen covered her mouth. I continued. Thomas was different. He never asked what my land was worth. He asked whether the furnace in my barn office was still making that terrible noise. He showed up when fences broke, when storms knocked out power, and when everyone else had a reason they were too busy. Stephen shifted in his chair. Then I reached the paragraph George had never discussed with me. 12 years ago, Stephen's company was close to failure. Thomas quietly provided $90,000 so I could help save it. He demanded no recognition and asked me never to reveal where the money came from because he knew Stephen's pride would not accept help from him. Stephen's face drained of color. That's a lie. Judge Hayes immediately said, Mr. Whitaker remained silent. I kept reading. I repaid Thomas over 4 years. Stephen never knew. Karen never knew. Brian never knew. I knew. And I never forgot that the man my sons treated like an outsider risked nearly half his retirement to protect one of them without asking for credit. Karen looked at me through tears. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. I couldn't answer. George's letter continued. This is why Thomas is successor trustee. I am not giving him my farm. I am giving him the responsibility of protecting it. He cannot sell it to himself. He cannot turn it into personal wealth. His duty is to preserve what my wife and I built until the trust's conditions are satisfied. I chose the person who wanted the least because he was the person I trusted with the most. The courtroom was completely silent. The final paragraph was addressed directly to his children. Stephen, if this letter is being read in court, then you chose money over the opportunity I gave you to stop. Brian, following your brother did not make his choices yours until you willingly participated in them. Karen, fear of conflict can become its own kind of betrayal when silence helps the wrong person. I hope all 3 of you understand someday that inheritance is not proof of love. And Thomas, if you're reading this, don't use my trust to punish them. Protect the farm. Let the truth handle the rest. I lowered the pages. Stephen's attorney requested time to respond, but Judge Hayes asked Rebecca whether the original trust contained the same restrictions described in George's statement. Yes, Your Honor. She explained that the farmland remained inside the trust. Stephen and Brian could receive limited distributions under its terms, but neither could force a sale, subdivision, mortgage, or transfer for development. I received no ownership interest. Judge Hayes looked toward Stephen's table. The claim that Mr. Reed manipulated George Whitaker to obtain this farm is difficult to reconcile with a trust that gives Mr. Reed no beneficial ownership of it. Stephen stared down. Then Karen suddenly stood. Your Honor, may I say something? After a brief exchange between the attorneys, Judge Hayes allowed it. Karen faced the court. My husband didn't isolate my father. I helped isolate my husband because I believed my brothers before I asked my father what he wanted. Thomas kept a promise, and I punished him for it. She looked at me. I'm sorry. Judge Hayes recessed before issuing his decision. 40 minutes later, we returned. He found the evidence established that George possessed testamentary capacity, acted independently, and understood the trust's consequences. The challenge based on undue influence was denied. The trust remained valid. Stephen closed his eyes. Brian began crying quietly. I felt no victory. I only felt tired. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around us. Mr. Reed, you control the Whitaker farm now. What are you going to do with it? I stopped. I don't control it. I protect it. A reporter called. Do you feel vindicated? I thought about George sitting on that porch, warning me not to let revenge change me. No. A family lost its father. Nobody wins that. I walked past the cameras with Karen beside me. Rebecca caught up near the courthouse steps. Thomas, there's one more thing you need to understand about George's trust. I turned. What? She handed me a copy of the final provisions. Winning the case was only the beginning. Now you have to decide how to keep the farm alive. The paper inside George's envelope shook slightly in my hands. His handwriting covered 3 pages. Judge Robert Hayes nodded. Read it, Mr. Reed. I swallowed and began. To my children, and to anyone who believes Thomas Reed persuaded me to make decisions I did not understand. These words are mine. Karen lowered her head. Stephen stared straight ahead. I loved all 3 of my children, but love does not require blindness. Stephen began measuring this farm in dollars while I was still measuring my remaining life in seasons. Brian helped him calculate what my fields could become after I was gone. Karen saw enough to know something was wrong, but too often chose peace over questions. Karen covered her mouth. I continued. Thomas was different. He never asked what my land was worth. He asked whether the furnace in my barn office was still making that terrible noise. He showed up when fences broke, when storms knocked out power, and when everyone else had a reason they were too busy. Stephen shifted in his chair. Then I reached the paragraph George had never discussed with me. 12 years ago, Stephen's company was close to failure. Thomas quietly provided $90,000 so I could help save it. He demanded no recognition and asked me never to reveal where the money came from because he knew Stephen's pride would not accept help from him. Stephen's face drained of color. That's a lie. Judge Hayes immediately said, Mr. Whitaker, remain silent. I kept reading. I repaid Thomas over 4 years. Stephen never knew. Karen never knew. Brian never knew. I knew. And I never forgot that the man my sons treated like an outsider risked nearly half his retirement to protect one of them without asking for credit. Karen looked at me through tears. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. I couldn't answer. George's letter continued. This is why Thomas is successor trustee. I am not giving him my farm. I am giving him the responsibility of protecting it. He cannot sell it to himself. He cannot turn it into personal wealth. His duty is to preserve what my wife and I built until the trust's conditions are satisfied. I chose the person who wanted the least because he was the person I trusted with the most. The courtroom was completely silent. The final paragraph was addressed directly to his children. Stephen, if this letter is being read in court, then you chose money over the opportunity I gave you to stop. Brian, following your brother did not make his choices yours until you willingly participated in them. Karen, fear of conflict can become its own kind of betrayal when silence helps the wrong person. I hope all 3 of you understand someday that inheritance is not proof of love. And Thomas, if you're reading this, don't use my trust to punish them. Protect the farm. Let the truth handle the rest. I lowered the pages. Stephen's attorney requested time to respond, but Judge Hayes asked Rebecca whether the original trust contained the same restrictions described in George's statement. Yes, Your Honor. She explained that the farmland remained inside the trust. Stephen and Brian could receive limited distributions under its terms, but neither could force a sale, subdivision, mortgage, or transfer for development. I received no ownership interest. Judge Hayes looked toward Stephen's table. The claim that Mr. Reed manipulated George Whitaker to obtain this farm is difficult to reconcile with a trust that gives Mr. Reed no beneficial ownership of it. Stephen stared down. Then Karen suddenly stood. Your Honor, may I say something? After a brief exchange between the attorneys, Judge Hayes allowed it. Karen faced the court. My husband didn't isolate my father. I helped isolate my husband because I believed my brothers before I asked my father what he wanted. Thomas kept a promise, and I punished him for it. She looked at me. I'm sorry. Judge Hayes recessed before issuing his decision. 40 minutes later, we returned. He found the evidence established that George possessed testamentary capacity, acted independently, and understood the trust's consequences. The challenge based on undue influence was denied. The trust remained valid. Stephen closed his eyes. Brian began crying quietly. I felt no victory. I only felt tired. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded around us. Mr. Reed, you control the Whitaker farm now. What are you going to do with it? I stopped. I don't control it. I protect it. A reporter called. Do you feel vindicated? I thought about George sitting on that porch, warning me not to let revenge change me. No. A family lost its father. Nobody wins that. I walked past the cameras with Karen beside me. Rebecca caught up near the courthouse steps. Thomas, there's one more thing you need to understand about George's trust. I turned. What? She handed me a copy of the final provisions. Winning the case was only the beginning. Now you have to decide how to keep the farm alive.